In recent years, there has been a noticeable trend throughout popular TV and film of portraying interracial couples in media, which consistently pairs BIPOC characters with predominantly white love interests. This pattern follows a long history of underrepresenting people of color in dominant media, but even despite the diversification of cast and characters in the last few decades, there continues to be implications of historical racial hierarchies present, as well as perpetuations of racial stereotypes. Specifically with regard to young adult media, it is important that we not just credit the racial diversification of media production, but that we as the audience take a critical lens to analyzing the types of representation being portrayed and how these narratives impact the larger social perspective towards race and sexuality. So throughout this video, I will conduct a media content analysis of several popular media outlets and use them to answer the following question. How do dominant media portrayals of romantic relationships in young adult TV and film perpetuate the reality of intersectional gender inequalities and sexual racism? To conduct this analysis, we will first look at the theoretical frameworks that I will be applying to the chosen media content, followed by a brief history of sexual racism and how racial inequalities have laid the foundations for society as we see it today. Once that's established, I will dive into the media content itself and discuss how repeated portrayals of characters of color in relationships tie into dominant racial stereotypes held by mass society. And lastly, we will look at real-life implications of the supposed fictional portrayals of race and culture and how they influence a significant amount of perceptions and attractions surrounding people of color. So first we're going to establish a couple of terms here. So the first is intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality in 1991 to explain the complexities that Black women experience by virtue of being both a racial and gender minority. According to her work, dominant conceptions of discrimination condition us to think about subordination as disadvantage occurring along a single categorical axis, which leads to erasure for individuals that fall into the center of these intersecting identities because society only labels them under one category or the other. Instead, Crenshaw proposes the idea of two roads intersecting, where each oppressed identity can be visualized as a different street. In this case, for example, we can think of one street as representing race, while the other represents sex. In the point in which they meet, however, there is a new entity that is created which is separate from the existence of either road on their own and is indicative of entirely new and diverse experiences that individuals face by virtue of belonging to more than one minority identity. The number of crossing paths can be infinite, but the focal point of the theoretical framework is to analyze that central point of intersection where new experiences of discrimination and identity come to light. And this applies to our purposes when we discuss sexual racism. And this term is defined by Silvestrini as discrimination between potential sexual or romantic partners on the basis of perceived racial identity and is a fundamental term that explores the intersection of race and sexuality. So this becomes a subset of Crenshaw's theory in that she argues gender and race discourses are predicated on a discrete set of experiences that often do not accurately reflect the interaction of race and gender. So in taking an intersectional approach, these theoretical perspectives will allow us to grasp a full picture of structural inequalities when looking at people of color in interracial relationships in media. And as I stated before, these concepts will be applied to popular Western young adult media, specifically those which have gained a particularly broad audience through dominant streaming services, and therefore have access to a younger audience. I also handpick content sources which feature diverse characters and interracial relationships in order to conduct a thoroughly critical review of the types of representation being depicted in these forms of media and what this says about the dominant narratives of race, gender, and sexuality. So the history of racial hierarchy is obviously a long one, but it stems back to the origins of colonialism, when European imperial powers spread the notion that people of color needed to be civilized into the white ideal. And this movement was based upon an us versus them mentality, which was fueled by Orientalist discourse, and was present at the time when the foundations for modern society were laid down. With regard to sexual racism, anti-miscegenation laws were established to forbid marriage across racial lines during the colonial period, and interracial marriage was prohibited in many states until the Supreme Court case of Loving v. Virginia outlawed this form of discrimination in 1967. The message leading up to this court decision mainly centered around scapegoating Western fear and promoting images of protecting the West from the supposed evil which was sourced from the East. This particularly emphasized hatred toward black men, while viewing racialized women as objects of sex to be used for white men. Residential racial segregation also has a centuries-long history that, despite the ending of Jim Crow's policies decades ago, endures to the present and is an important factor in the perpetuation of racial inequality. Another historical example of this, which was arguably committed in an opposite respect, was the mass normalization of rape against Indigenous women by the Catholic clergy throughout their time at residential schools. These acts were federally mandated in an attempt to kill the Indian in the child and create a gradual westernization of Indigenous children through each generation. These horrible acts have continued until as recent as the 90s, and therefore it is unsurprising that these racial divisions still exist within our current society and make appearances through our most prominent social influences, such as media. These historical impacts take form in modern media relationships, which are arguably dominant influencers of modern political and racial ideologies. For example, many young adult TV and film plotlines center around a love triangle, where the protagonist finds himself required to make a choice between two potential romantic partners. Over and over again, we see that the protagonist deserts a character of color, regardless of their commitment and respect to the relationship with the protagonist, because they choose to pursue their true feelings for a white character. The message in these plotlines communicates that white men should always be the partner to strive for, particularly when the protagonist is a woman of color or a stereotypically feminine gay man of color. For example, in the film series The Kissing Booth, the main character Elle gains a friend in Marco, who is a Latino man, and must make an emotional choice between him and her long-distance white boyfriend, Noah. In the TV series Ginny and Georgia, Ginny begins a relationship with Hunter, an Asian man who makes repeated romantic gestures to profess his feelings for her, but she falls for a white man instead, Marcus, whose communication of feelings is limited to sneaking through her bedroom at night. Then we have Belly in the series The Summer I Turned Pretty, who finds no flaws in her boyfriend Cam, but simply cannot deny her feelings for Conrad despite having been rejected by him repeatedly over the course of her life. And again, we have Laura Jean in To All the Boys I've Loved Before, who gives up a healthy relationship with an African-American student, John Ambrose, to see things through with her on and off again relationship with Peter Kavinsky. These BIPOC characters often lack substance as individuals and are arguably only introduced to help the protagonist realize their true feelings for a white character. Furthermore, this is a blatant example of white people being hierarchically ranked above non-white people in more underlying and discrete ways. These are just a few examples of fictional relationships which conform to this dominant narrative of female protagonists being socially measured in accordance with their proximity to a white man, and such patterns can no longer be considered coincidental. And this alludes back to the colorist ideas throughout residential schools, where being told to marry lighter so that you can have lighter babies and make the race lighter defines who you are attracted to because you assume that you're supposed to be attracted to them. And while this may not be a direct reasoning behind the pattern of preference for white, masculine, heterosexual men, it certainly has social and political undertones from the racial division and gender roles which have been embedded in society within the last century. Another harmful impact of these hierarchies on the basis of race ties back to Crenshaw's intersectional theory, in that BIPOC characters, while already being attributed with a deviant label, are also portrayed as deviant with regard to gender norms. where the Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient led to a widespread normalization of sexualizing Asian women for their exotic and stereotypical sexual identity. It also created a social rejection for racialized men. For example, Asian men are emasculated in the media and portrayed as very feminine due to an Orientalist assumption about Asian masculinity, which is socially dubbed as inferior to the dominant white heteromasculinity. We can see these exact narratives being traced in modern media, specifically media content such as Never Have I Ever, To All the Boys I've Loved Before, and The Summer I Turned Pretty. They all portray Asian women in the center of several potential relationships, which gives nod to the assumption of hypersexuality attributed to women of color. In comparison, men of color are simultaneously stripped of their masculinity, often appearing more emotional or passive, which are stereotypically feminine attributes according to Western standards. This image of passivity and feminine identity contrasts with the heteromasculinity, which is textbook for white love interests who display characteristics of assertiveness, jealousy, and anger, which are always seen as more desirable. These contracting characters and the intersection of race and gender clearly exemplify how media perpetuates the ideals of masculinity and femininity for different racial identities and influences society into ranking these labels hierarchically at the continuous expense of racial and gender minorities. Now, it's not fair to assume that the protagonists in media only choose romantic partners solely on behalf of their race and gender expression. But what I am saying is that media production companies are not blind to the stereotypes and underlying messaging that are being communicated through their content. A key concept of media production is that it is entirely profit-driven, and this is in large part why we see such an overrepresentation of white personas in media. Western media corporations make profit by catering to the dominant population, this being white people. In more recent years, however, media has viewed the representations of minority communities as commodities for drawing in more demographics of people. However, the subliminal ideology still remains ingrained in media in many aspects that whiteness and heteromasculinity are to be ultimately desired and strived for. So what are some of the real-life implications of media's portrayal of race? So as we know, media has a huge impact on what we as a society think is beautiful. And so to analyze that, I focused my research on the real-life beauty standards that are heavily influenced by what the media deems as beautiful. And one of the most prominent examples of this was the White Boy of the Month trend, which has become very popular on Twitter and other large social media platforms. This trend translates to the glorification of rising white cis male actors who appear to society as the new embodiment of the male beauty standard, and they receive widespread attention online as a result of this. The most recent examples are actors such as Timothée Chalamet, Jacob Elordi, Noah Centineo, Dylan O'Brien, Matthew Gray Gubler, Miles Teller, Ross Lynch, and Rudy Pankow, to name a few. In comparison, there are very few male BIPOC actors who receive the same online buzz unless they not only meet those predetermined Eurocentric beauty standards, but also exceed them in their physical attributes. And some examples of this include Michael B. Jordan, Jordan Fisher, and Regé-Jean Page. The clearly defined difference here, as explained by Silvestrini, is that white men are praised for setting the beauty standard in the first place, while men of color are merely recognized for meeting the standard. This further exemplifies how whiteness is an invisible perspective, and that whites are placed as the norm, the ordinary, and the standard, while BIPOC are hierarchically ranked on the basis of how adequately they are able to meet these expectations. Even in looking at the conventionally attractive male actors of color here, it is evident that they are all light-skinned individuals, which I thought was very interesting because it speaks to society's tendency to equate beauty and higher status with lighter skin color, even amongst non-white communities. And we can see that in how we don't see a lot of darker-skinned individuals making this internet list of attractive male actors. So, does this prove that white men are ranked higher on the aesthetic hierarchy than other ethnicities? Well, in Silvestrini's study on attraction and relationships with people of color, she concluded that the majority of interviewees agreed that racial stereotypes can affect sexual or romantic attraction towards members of a certain race or ethnic background. For example, the stereotype of Asian men being more stereotypically feminine influenced many female participants to conclude that they were not romantically attracted to Asian men, and instead held a preference for white or black men who are stereotypically attributed with more masculine qualities such as aggression, athletic ability, and physical strength. This tells us that not only are men of color diminished on the basis of their perceived inferior physical appearance, but also on account of the stereotypes communicated through popular media outlets such as movies and TV, which shed negative and deviant light on characters of color and indirectly translates to realistic ideas and scenarios. This has negative consequences for both the external treatment of racial minorities as well as the mental health and self-image of these individuals. Respondents proposed that racial stereotypes were often perpetuated by the media and could affect attraction towards different racial backgrounds because media stereotypes created an image of how these individuals ought to be approached or treated. It was found that these images led to internalized racism and low self-esteem on the part of minority groups, which further perpetuates the harm of wrongful media representation. In conclusion, representations of romantic relationships in young adult media have a significant impact on the narratives taken by society as a whole, especially with regard to the messages it spreads with concern to intersectional gender and race inequalities. The historical divisions of race which separated white populations from people of color are still prominent in underlying social institutions which structure our society today. And one of its largest ideological outlets is media production and qualitative representation in TV and film. Some potential critiques of the study surround my choice of samples, which are not universal in their perpetration of sexual racism and racially gendered stereotypes. I looked at specific examples which categorically apply to my study on the lack of representation of media, but there are also depictions of interracial couples which do not include a white love interest or perpetuate negative stereotypes. Furthermore, this is not to say that the improvement of sexual and racial representation is inherently a bad thing. There are also many positive aspects to portraying interracial relationships in media. However, what this theoretical application aims to communicate is not a universality of the intersectional oppression of race and gender in media, but rather a repetitive and consistent pattern when depicting romantic relations with elements of race and gender inequalities. An area of further inquiry would be to further analyze race and gender relations in progressively younger media content to discern the early subliminal messaging which socializes young children from an early age with regard to their perspectives on race and gender, specifically those of white children. As we have established that media is one of the most influential factors in defining our worldview, an interesting topic of research could pertain to the beginnings of these influences and how they lay the foundations for the perpetrations of social divisions and inequalities later in life. Thank you for watching. That's it.